our recording. Hello and welcome everyone to Calendar Club. We're so glad that you're here this evening. We pray that you will be richly blessed by the word of Yahuwah as it comes out of the mouth of our teachers this evening from your Torah. And for those of you that are on YouTube, we just want to take a special moment just to give you a warm welcome and let you know that we're glad that you're here as well. Shall we, everyone? Let's unmute our mics. Blessings. Shalom.
Shalom, everyone. Shalom.
Bless you.
Shalom.
Shalom,
Everyone. Shalom.
And for those of you that would be part of our discussion group at Teachings, visit covenantcalendar.com. Look up to join us live on Friday evenings with the Covenant Calendar. With that being said, we're going to go ahead and give the screen over to our instructor, Charlene. I believe you're presenting this evening. And
yes, I am. And I just want to welcome everybody here tonight. We have some new faces, and it's nice to have our old friends back. Some of you haven't been here for a while. And we are going to be just doing something a little bit easier tonight. We've been working on Joshua with Tim, the Joshua Enoch flavor. And tonight we are going to go back to the regular Joshua study for a couple of weeks until we can get Joshua Enoch Part 3 ready. But I just want to say to you that this is specifically about wave sheaf. And as we get started, we are going to be looking at chapters 1 to 5, not in complete detail, but some very interesting things. Now, this particular study started out as a Dawn Day study. We found it because of the Dawn Day study, but the emphasis is not going to be there tonight. We are going to be looking strictly at the placement of wave sheaf and how we can know exactly where Joshua places it for their first Passover in Canaan. So let's get started with this. And like I said, this is an old study with a brand new face look. I think you'll really enjoy it. There's some new things in here. And for those of you that are new tonight, we have some review. So I think that will help. There's a little bit of review and repetition. Hopefully that will help, and lots of charts that you can look at and enjoy. But anyway, this study was first done in 2018, and we've taught this one at every single feast. Everyone always enjoys it, and even at our last Sukkot, we had it again, and it was enjoyed by all. But the studies have lots of evidence from Joshua. These are some of the things. There are 3 interesting patterns for counting to 3 in this study. Now, you might say, well, what? So what? What do I need to know that for? Well, I'll tell you what. When you're starting to learn how to count timelines, especially when it comes to the Messianic timeline, which is 3 days and 3 nights, you're going to want to know how to count to 3. And it might sound easy, but maybe it's not. We're also going to do some comparisons between Joshua and one of the more popular Enoch calendars and their count for placement, and seeing how it differs from Joshua. Of course, Joshua is using Moses' instructions for Passover and for wave sheaf, and then eventually it will be Pentecost. We'll do that in part 2. This is part 1 tonight. We're just going to spend one slide on comparisons between Joshua's timing for the weekly Sabbath and lunar Sabbath reckoning for theirs. Just one single slide. And last but not least, Joshua is going to give us a solid confirmation on the statute placement for wave sheaf. So for once and for all, there is absolutely no more question about where this festival should be celebrated. And we will finish part 2, hopefully next week, and show you exactly why. So we're doing part 1 this week. And some of these slides might look a little bit familiar, and that's okay. We have some new people here tonight too. But we're saying that Yahuwah's calendar has to have a restoration. There's been pagan calendars around way too long, and there's been way too many of us that really believe that those counterfeit calendars were the true calendar. And so what we're finding is that those that want to follow Yahuwah in his footsteps and respond to him in worship and adoration, and they want to honor the sabbatical worship statutes, and of course the festivals, that to find the correct calendar really is important to them. But we've noticed in our study over the last 10 or 11 years that the enemy has been very clever and he knows what's happening. So he has somehow managed to get many of Yahuwah's sincere followers completely sidetracked when it comes to honoring their appointed times for Yahuwah. And lots of them don't know that they're giving homage to man's pagan traditions and many counterfeit festal calendars. And of course, these have all replaced all of the divine appointments, or at least several of them. So we know that restoration of Yahuwah's divine calendar is a huge task, and we've been working on it for quite a while, and it is coming to fruition. But the good news is that there are a few who believe that Yahuwah's perfect divine calendar, the covenant calendar, has been restored through a careful search of the scriptures. And that's an exciting part. It's the scriptures only. And there's even better news than that. We feel that Yahuwah's divine calendar is simple, it's easy, it's logical, and it's elegant. And yes, I'm going to say very elegant and pleasing. Even children can understand it. So we believe that restoration is important, and especially for Wave Sheaf. We're finding that the Wave Sheaf Festival really needs to be restored. But there's some things to consider about that. Even though the weekly Sabbath has been restored to commence in the morning at the dawn twilight rather than sunset, and I mean morning twilight, not sunrise, okay? To commence at the morning twilight instead of sunset or midnight or sunrise. We have all those options, so we've got that part restored in calendar. And even though the commencement of the new month has been restored by just counting to 30 instead of searching for a barley ripeness or some phase of the lunars, a month up there, and going by that, we've got that piece figured out. And even though we basically have the commencement of the new year has been restored by waiting for that spring equinox to usher out the old year and bring in the new year, and we're watching for the shadow sign to know when that really does happen instead of waiting for that moon phase, there is something else to consider. There can still be confusion over the placement of the Wave Sheaf Festival, which ultimately affects the placement of Pentecost that comes 50 days later. Now, that's not the only problem. In many feast camps, they completely forget about the Wave Sheaf Festival. They don't even acknowledge it when it comes along. So we just feel that it needs to have restoration in more areas than one. And some may say, is there really confusion over the placement of Wave Sheaf? Like, can that really be so? And then there's a lot of other people that say, you know what, it really doesn't matter because Wave Sheaf isn't all that important anyway. My feast camp never ever talks about it. They never pay any attention to it, so it just can't be that crucial. I'm sure my leaders would know. But you know, if there's any question about the placement of where Wave Sheaf should be celebrated and Pentecost, the best thing to do is to go to the scriptures and find out. But you have to know how to do it. So Joshua, Moses' sidekick, who was walking in Moses' boots all the way, he's going to walk us through this proper placement of Wave Sheaf, through this wonderful encounter that Israel experienced when they finally got to enter the land of Canaan, and it was after 40 years. So this study addresses the Wave Sheaf as first fruits during the Passover festival, not after the festival, but inside the 8-day festival, from Passover to the last day of unleavened bread. Now, there are some festival options, and tonight we're going to examine 2 ways that the Wave Sheaf Festival can be celebrated. And no matter what day Wave Sheaf is celebrated on, in most cases, that 50-day Omer count is going to be established right back to the Wave Sheaf, and it will be on the same day of the week. So if you've got your Wave Sheaf on the first day of the week or a Sunday, Pentecost is going to be on a Sunday. We know that some of them do Wave Sheaf on Tuesdays and Wednesdays and Thursdays, you know, and they do their 50-day count, and their Pentecost will be on the same day of the week, 50 days later. So both are affected equally But this study is going to offer two options. Option number one, will the wave sheaf follow the first Sabbath of unleavened bread on Abib 16? Or is wave sheaf going to follow the weekly Sabbath within the Passover festival? And that weekly Sabbath has a Strong's number of 7676. You're going to see this number quite a bit tonight. Now, we know that there are a lot more testimonies for the proper placement of wave sheaf than what we were taught. For a long time, it seemed like only Leviticus 23 and Numbers 15 were the only witnesses for proper placement. And you know what everyone says, you need 2 or 3 witnesses. Well, there's 2 witnesses right there. But you know what? There's better news than that, because there are now 3 more strong witnesses from the scriptures. And there's also a secular historical account to help us to understand the divine placement of wave sheaf. So Leviticus 23 and Numbers 15 are really important. Those are extremely important Torah verses. There is another study that uses Exodus 12, the Passover, and Exodus 16, the quail and manna, and Exodus 19, the few days before Pentecost at Mount Sinai. That study also tells you when to place first fruits or wave sheaf. We're not looking at that part tonight. Then there's the Joshua, chapters 3 to 5. We're going to be, of course, using that. The gospel account includes the Wednesday crucifixion, the Sabbath resurrection, and a first day ascension. This is another study that is a witness to the proper placement of wave sheaf. And then there's secular historical information around Rashbe, and there's a quote from Julian Morgenstern. We're going to do this part in next week's study, or part 2, whenever we have it. So there's at least 5 witnesses, maybe 6 or 7 if you count out all the chapters. But there's a lot of testimonies for where to put the wave sheaf. So this study tonight is going to be addressing Leviticus 1 and the book of Numbers. And we're also going to take a look at Joshua. And between this point number 1 and point number 2, that is part 1 of this study. And then in the next part, we will do part of Joshua, and we will add in the history to see part 2 of the study. And the history is very, very important. This complete study is going to cover Leviticus and Numbers in the first option there. And in number 2, Joshua. We're going to put these 2 together for part 1 tonight. And then in part 2, we're going to put Joshua together with the history. And we also see that Joshua is going to have 3 sets of counting patterns for 1, 2, 3. And I just hope that you really enjoy this part. And then, of course, that statement from the Hebrew Union College in the United States is going to be very interesting, a really good support for where wave sheaf is really supposed to be, according to the scriptures. So tonight, Joshua's study is going to prove this, that Passover and the weekly Sabbath are both on Abib 14. That might be a surprise to some of you, but I'm telling you right up front, that's what he's going to prove. And number 2 is going to prove that unleavened bread is indeed on Abib 15, where it's supposed to be. And number 3, he's going to prove that the wave sheaf is placed on Abib 15, not Abib 16, the way most of the feast calendars have it. So that's what you'll be looking for tonight. So the question is, are you ready? Because we're going to get started. We have 63 slides to get through. We'll just do a little bit review here of the first couple chapters before we get into our study to give a foundation and a background. And just remember that there was no observance of wave sheaf in the wilderness. And because of Israel's sin with that golden calf, there was a whole new set of laws for the Aaronic priesthood and the sanctuary services, and sacrificial laws were commanded upon these people in more abundance than ever before. And then shortly after that, in the second year, I believe it was on the first day of the first month, the sanctuary was raised up, and by Israel sinned again, and they refused to enter Canaan, based on that evil report of 10 of the 12 spies. And since Moses was not going to be leading them now into the land of Canaan, Yahuwah did go ahead and give explicit instructions on how to observe the very first wave sheaf upon their entrance into the land. So they ended up staying in the wilderness for 40 years because of these sins and denial to go into the new land. There was no wave sheaf participated in, no Passovers after that second one. They were there to learn a lesson. So that very first observance of spring feasts in Canaan is going to be given to us from Joshua, and he's preparing to take this lead. And like I said, the study is based on the day beginning with dawn, not sunset and not sunrise, and that's how this study was found. But there are so many gems in it. So like I already mentioned, and just for a quick review, Joshua's going to show that Passover was on Abib 14. It was a seventh-day Sabbath. Wave sheaf is on Abib 15, and the first day of unleavened bread is also on Abib 15. And that information is necessary so you can follow the charts that we're going to show you. So we're ready to launch into these 3 patterns of learning how to count to 3. We'll do some of these charts first. In Joshua chapter 1, he is getting ready to prepare the people. In verses 1 and 9, his book begins with a divine commission to go in and take the land of Canaan. And there was a promise given in verse 3 that wherever the soles of their sandals tread, that land is reserved for Israel. And then in verses 10 to 22 of Joshua 1, you see that Joshua is giving commands to the officers for what they're going to do to take this land. But verse 11 is really important. He says, "Pass through the camp and command the people, saying, prepare provisions for yourselves, for within 3 days you will cross this Jordan to go in to possess the land, which Yahuwah your Elohim is giving you to possess." So here's our charts, and we're going to have quite a few of these so you don't lose your bearings. But we're starting out with the 6th cycle. It is going to be a Friday, and it's Abib 6. I'm putting these dates in here so that you can see how the events progress forward from the 6th of Abib up to Passover on the 14th. So in this first box, to cross the Jordan in 3 days has been a command, and what you're going to find out is that it does not include Abib 6, okay? So there's your first day, your second day, and your third day. So this count to 3 starts at dawn on the day of Abib 6, and that happens to be a Sabbath. You count 3 days, and what did Joshua say? He said after the 3rd day, Israel's going to cross the Jordan. So you have to know how to count to 3, and so did they. And that is your first set of counting to 3. We'll put all of the sets on the charts. But the question is, will the calendar events stem from Abib 6, or do we have the wrong date? Let's watch this very carefully. Everything will be labeled on the charts. I'll have quite a few of these slides, this pretty background, and there'll be just kind of little reviews as we go through. There's quite a few of them, maybe 15 or 18 of them, and they're all numbered, okay? So I think we go up to number 10. But anyway, number 1, Joshua is going to confirm that Abib 14 is the weekly Sabbath. So right there on the 14th, that is a weekly Sabbath. So that means by default that Abib 1, or the very first day of the new year, has to be on the first cycle when Israel is entering the land. This is the calendar for Israel. And don't forget, Abib 10 is a very special day too. Remember, that was the day they chose the lamb. So Abib 1 on this calendar that Joshua is on this particular year actually does start on the first day of the week. Joshua's calendar year does not follow the Enoch calendar, because we're going to find that the Enoch calendar claims this. Enoch says that Abib 1 is always right here on the 4th cycle of the week, every single year in the most popular Enoch calendars. You can see that's different than what was happening in the year of Joshua. And we did this last time only in the Enoch months, month number 3, number 6, and month 9, and month 12. Those are the only months that you will find the 14th day of the month is coming on top of the 7th day, Sabbath of the week. But we're talking about the first month, not month 3, 6, 9, or 12. So this is a slide from an Enoch Zadok video. They say there's 52 Sabbaths per year. And so we're going to look and see if there is a Sabbath that exists on the 14th cycle in the first or the second month of Enoch. Well, here's the first month. You can see what they say. The Sabbaths are 4, 11, 18, and 25. So there's no Sabbath on the 14th in the first month. You can see month 4 and month 7 and month 10. They all have their Sabbaths on those exact same dates. And when we look at month number 2, because there's some that say, well, you know what, this Joshua story is in month 2, not month 1. But guess what? There is no 14th Sabbath in month 2. There's a Sabbath on the 2nd, the 9th, the 16th, the 23rd, and the 30th. But there is no Sabbath on the 14th. So Enoch doesn't have a leg to stand on. There are no weekly Sabbaths on Enoch's calendar on the 14th day of the month in either the first or the second month. So they are not qualifying according to Joshua. In chapter 2 of Joshua, we're going to read about Rahab and the spies. And this is where the spies receive special instructions from Rahab to hide 3 days in the mountains. So we'll start with our chart here in box number 2. Joshua has sent out 2 spies, and I'm pretty sure they probably started out in the morning. And it appears to me that Joshua fully expected those spies to complete their assignment on the day season of the 6th cycle, or Friday, which is the preparation day. And then I think he expected them to be back to camp before the Sabbath started the next morning. However, the plans got delayed due to suspicions that were coming from residents in Jericho. So it didn't happen that way. What happened was that Rahab found these spies, and she hides them. She actually hides them on her roof around the evening time of the day. How do we know? Because it tells us that Jericho closes their gates when it gets dark. And she was questioned, and she declared, oh no, the spies left before the gates were closed. So we know that she was hiding them maybe just before it was getting dark. Around in that time she had hid them. Well, Rahab didn't send them away until it was dark because she didn't want to take any chances that they would get seen. And she told them to head for the mountains. And she said to stay there for 3 days and not to come out of the mountains because she didn't want anybody to find them. So those 3 days for the spies commenced from the time that they fled to the mountains. Those 3 days did not start at dawn or the morning twilight. So off they go, and they hide 3 days in the mountains, right up to the night of Abib 9. So here's where they are hiding. It's going to be dark. Remember, she let them go when they were dark, so we're counting it from Abib 6 night. There's your first day. Okay, so they were in the mountains over the Sabbath, okay, from Friday night to the Sabbath day. Then Sabbath night on the 7th, all the way up to Sunday day. And then at night, the 3rd day, took them all the way up to the night of Monday. There is your second set of counting to 3. It's a little bit different. When Joshua said you're going to cross the Jordan in 3 days, remember, that starts in the morning. But the spies, their 3 days didn't start till the dark. In chapter 3, Joshua is preparing to cross the Jordan. And the spies come back on Monday night in the evening. It says in chapter 3, verse 2, and it came to be after 3 days that the officers went into the midst of the camp. And in verse 3, this is a very busy Monday night. In verse 3 it says, and they commanded the people, saying, When you see the Ark of the Covenant of Yahuwah your Elohim, and the priests, the Levites bearing it, then you shall set out from your place and follow it. So I've got the chart here so that you know what's happening. So this is where the instructions are being given. We'll see it on the next slide. And then early in the morning on Abib 10, Joshua is getting up early, it says, and Joshua rose early in the morning, and they set out from Shittim and came to the Jordan, he and all the children of Israel, and they stayed there before they passed over. Because they're going to pass over the Jordan in the morning of Abib 10. And the next chart is going to pick up right from here, from Abib 9. We're still in chapter 3, crossing the Jordan, and this is a very memorable day. Remember I said we're going to pick up our chart from Abib 9. So this is the last of the count of the first count of 3. This is their third day right here that they're waiting to cross the Jordan. And the spies have come back. This is the third day ending of when they were in the mountains. They've been hiding for 3 days, and now they're back right here just as it's getting dark. And the officers then immediately, they begin to give commands for the Ark of the Covenant. And the people are told to sanctify themselves because on tomorrow, that's the 10th day of the month, there's going to be wonders. So they're saying, everybody get ready. It was a very busy Monday night, or Abib 9 night. And we were told, we already read, that Joshua rose early in the morning, and that's on the 10th day, and he set out for the Jordan with Israel. He had a little ways to walk. And the priests took up the Ark of the Covenant, and they cross over before the people. So Abib 10 is the day that they are crossing over into the land of Canaan, crossing over the Jordan. It was a really great day. And Yahuwah said, this day, on this Abib 10, is the day that I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel. It was a very special day, this day. And if you read on, you'll find out there was about 40,000 people that crossed the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month. Well, let's see what happens next in Joshua chapter 4. It's about Jordan's memorial stones. When all of the people had completely crossed over the Jordan, the next divine command to Joshua was to select 12 men that represent every tribe, and they were to bring stones back, memorial stones back from the riverbed. That was the Jordan riverbed, to erect as an altar for a permanent sign of crossing the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month. And I wonder if those stones are still there, but that's what they did. And they also laid up a heap of stones in the Jordan, I believe. I just didn't include that information there. In Joshua chapter 5, it's the chapter about the men being circumcised. Let's read it. It's verses 2, 3, 8, and 9. At that time, Yahuwah said unto Joshua, make thee sharp knives, and circumcise again the children of Israel the second time. And Joshua made him sharp knives, and circumcised the children of Israel at the hill of the foreskins. And it came to pass, when they had done circumcising all the people, that they abode in their places in the camp, till they were whole. And Yahuwah said unto Joshua, this day I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from off of you, wherefore the name of the place is called Gilgal until this day, and that means to roll away. So this is a little chart of what we're going to see on the next slide. So here they've crossed the Jordan, okay? Abib 10, they crossed the Jordan, and day 1, day 2, and day 3, they were circumcised on Abib 10. Let's go and look and see what the scriptures tell us of what's going to happen all the way up to Abib 13. This is Joshua chapter 5 verses 2 to 9 about the men being circumcised. It's kind of a little interesting bit of information here. We know that the Jordan was crossed right there on the 10th day of the first month. And the command to circumcise the men to Joshua there was given because everybody that came out of Egypt had to be circumcised before the Passover. But there was no circumcision that was happening in the wilderness. So anybody that was born in the wilderness and hadn't been circumcised. They weren't circumcised at this point in time. So Joshua is being told that these men need to be circumcised before celebrating Passover in Canaan. So those flint knives were made to circumcise the sons of Israel. And after circumcising the men, they stayed in their camp places they were told to until they were healed. And the question is, how long would it be until they were healed? Well, we can take a little look in Genesis 34, verses 24 and 25. It has some clues about what happens, maybe not directly related to this story because we believe that there was a divine healing here for these men. But this is the story of Simeon and Levi and their sister Dinah and Hamor, who was the son of Shechem. And as you remember, Hamor, he just desperately wanted Dinah for his wife. And they said, no way. You can't marry any of our daughters because you don't belong to us. You aren't in covenant with our Elohim. Well, what do we have to do to be in covenant with your Elohim? Well, you have to all be circumcised. Do you remember the story? And then on the third day, look what it says. Every male was circumcised. Simeon and Levi did this. It says every male was circumcised who went out of the gate, and on the third day when they were in pain, guess what happened? Guess what Simeon and Levi did? They went and slew all the Shechemites. So they put an end to that. They said, nobody's going to defile our sister. So we know that in 3 days they were still not doing too good there in Genesis 34. If we want to follow the pattern in Genesis 34, can we not expect the men of Israel to need at least 3 days of healing? So it would have started right there. First day of healing would have been Wednesday, Abib 11, and the second day would have been Thursday, Abib 12, and the third day, look, would be Friday, Abib 13, taking us up to the day before Passover. It's probably a very good indication that they were circumcised so that they wouldn't really have the greatest temptation to go out and eat some of that grain that they were probably very, very hungry for. But on the fourth day, they should be doing better than ever and just in time for Passover on Abib 14, which was going to be the very next day. So we'll see. And that is your third set of counting to 3. So you've seen all 3 sets and how they start in different places. It's very interesting to know how to count to 3. Here's one of these review slides that Joshua will be confirming that Abib 11 was the 4th cycle of the week, or a Wednesday, when the circumcising began. But let's look what Enoch's calendar claims about Abib 11. Because Enoch always has Abib 1 on the 4th cycle, he starts right there. Look where his Abib 11 is. He has it on a weekly Sabbath. And I'm going to tell you, Joshua will not agree with Enoch's reckoning, not one little bit. So this first Passover to be celebrated in Canaan. In Joshua 5:10, it says, and the children of Israel encamped in Gilgal, and they kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month at even in the plains of Jericho. And I want to tell you that we are still assuming that Passover will be on Sabbath, Abib 14, and it will be exposed solidly just a little bit later in the study. We're going to watch for this all the way through. But the question is, can the Passover and the weekly Sabbath share the same day without any scriptural conflict? And also do remember, there's no manna that's sent on Sabbath. They get a double portion on Friday, so they're not gathering manna on Sabbath. That's something you want to remember as well. But what about Passover on a weekly Sabbath? Passover on the 7th day Sabbath? Some people say you can't do that. So we're asking weekly Sabbath, or should Passover ever be celebrated on a weekly Sabbath? Or should the festal calendar just be adjusted so Passover never falls on the weekly Sabbath? Those are important questions. And I'm going to show you 2 calendars from 2015 and 2016. This first one is a lunisolar calendar. They go by the moon. And the next one is a covenant calendar. In 2015, I can show you from their calendar that they had April 4 right there. You can see the color code here. Red is Passover. They had their Passover day on a Sabbath, and they had their unleavened bread feast on April 5. Now, I don't have the whole chart in here, the whole color key in here, but that would be their unleavened bread. And they were also putting first fruits on the first day of the week. You can see that they've got it in purple, okay? So that's a lunisolar solar calendar where they do calculate first fruits or wave sheaf on the first day of the week. In covenant calendar in the year 2016, it also had a Passover Sabbath. It was on April 2, right there. Passover was right there on April 2. And then the next day, the first day of the week, was unleavened bread. You can see on the color code here is the first Sabbath of unleavened bread, and it was also wave sheaf according to the Joshua study. So this is a comparison between a lunisolar calendar from another feast camp and covenant calendar, where both of them do have the Sabbath hosting a Passover. Nothing was changed. It was left right where it needs to be. So Joshua will be celebrating Abib 14 Passover on the weekly Sabbath. There's no need to adjust the date, but we want to question some of the Jewish calendars because we know that they do adjust the date to avoid celebrations on certain feasts on the weekly Sabbath. And Passover is one of those feasts, and so is Day of Atonement. They will adjust the calendar and put Passover and Day of Atonement on other days before or after. But there is no scriptural documentation to do any such thing. But the question is, well, maybe we should move Passover, because doesn't the Passover the Passover demand servile work and have to be doing things that you shouldn't be doing? And that's what some people feel, that if Passover falls on a weekly Sabbath, that you really should move it to Abib 15 so that the commands for the seventh day Sabbath and Passover can be all honored without any conflict at all. We'll just move it and make it convenient, right? Haven't found that in the scriptures yet. Maybe someone can find that verse and let us know if it's there. But even today, there are many of the Jews' calculations for Jewish festivals. They're all arbitrary. They're set by men. You cannot find them in the scripture. They just do it for convenience. And their annual festivals can be off as much as 2 days from the original day ordained. By whose calendar? It's their Jewish calendar. Their days can be off, especially if annual feasts occur on or even close to the weekly Sabbath. I think if Day of Atonement lands on a preparation day, Friday, they'll move it 2 days. There is no scriptural command to exempt Passover from falling on a weekly Sabbath. As it has been noted, the preparations for Passover can be done on the preparation day, and the extra Passover sacrifice, it wasn't to violation of Sabbath anyway. So no, Passover does not need to be moved. If it lands on the 14th day of the month and it's a Sabbath, you just go ahead and celebrate Passover. What about this unleavened bread for the first Passover in Canaan? Let's just read the box here in Leviticus 23:6. You all know this. On the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread unto Yahuwah. And even though Israel was in the land of Canaan and had grain all around them, the scriptural command was firm. Israel, you are not allowed to touch any of that grain. I don't care if it's old grain or new grain, wheat or barley, what, you just don't touch it. And you can't have any for unleavened bread on Abib 14 Passover. You'll have to figure out something else. So I think they used the manna. And remember, we're still assuming that Passover is on the seventh day Sabbath. So the first partaking of unleavened bread that came from grain became part of the festival on Abib 15 after the wave sheaf ceremony was completed. We've done some work in that area already. So let's go ahead and place the first Sabbath of unleavened bread onto our chart on the next slide. It'll be on Abib 15. So we have Passover on the 14th, and we have unleavened bread on the 15th, just like the scripture said. there in Joshua 5, verse 10 and 5, verse 11. The children kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month. It says they kept it at even in the plains of Jericho, and the 14th started in the morning, goes all the way to the next morning. That's what the scriptures say. And then on that Passover night, you all know what happened. There was that original command from Moses in Exodus 12. I'm going to read it. They shall eat the flesh of that Passover lamb on that night. That is the night of Passover day season. And if any of it is left until the morning, you shall burn it with fire. You shall not leave any of it, this is the Passover lamb, until the morning. And any of it that is left until the morning, you need to burn with fire. So morning is in there quite a few times. And remember that the dawn cycle exchange is right here, right at the break of day, the first light in the sky. The unleavened bread Sabbath was indeed on Abib 15, according to the command in Leviticus 23:6, and that's exactly the way it was to be celebrated. It started in the morning at the first light, and it went all the way to the end of the night season of Abib 15. And of course, we're still assuming that Passover is on the Sabbath. Let's take a little look at now the Passover on the 14th and compare it to Wave Sheaf on the 15th. We're making an assumption there as well. Joshua 5:11. I want you to remember it. It's easy to remember along with Leviticus 23:11 and Joshua 5:11. Really easy. These are the two main verses for this study. And they did eat of the old corn or grain. Corn is another word for grain. They did eat of the old grain of the land on the morrow after the Passover. They had unleavened cakes and parched corn on the self-same day. Well, let's look at this Hebrew definition from morrow. And I am using the Brown Driver Briggs this time because he actually does really well with his definitions. And he says morrow means the morrow, tomorrow, or the day after. It's pretty clear. But remember, none of it's sunrise either. So the morrow starts with the first light. We're still looking at Passover in comparison to Wave Sheaf with this morning. Morrow begins in the morning with the first arrival of twilight. Therefore, the Wave Sheaf or the First Fruits Festival begins right at that point. And Joshua 5:11 is very specific. He said, Israel ate the grain on the morrow after the Passover. So finally, after the Wave Sheaf ceremony has been completed, after that, Israel was allowed to take any of the old or the new grain to make unleavened bread according to the statute, because they're having to celebrate unleavened bread on the same day. So now they're allowed to go and get some of the grain. Finally, they've been waiting this long. Wave Sheaf is established right now on Abib 15 because it's following Passover. But we're still assuming if Passover is on the seventh-day Sabbath. We now know that Abib happened right after Passover, so we've got that one taken care of. Joshua has confirmed for us that the Wave Sheaf occurred on Abib 15. It was the morrow after Passover. It was not Abib 16, which is the morrow after the first unleavened bread Sabbath. So right here, we're saying that the Passover was on Sabbath. We're still assuming this, but the very next day on Abib 15 was Wave Sheaf. Joshua 5:11, I want to read it again. And they did eat of the old corn of the land on the morrow after the Passover. They had unleavened cakes and parched corn. But we still need to confirm if the morrow after the Passover is indeed also the morrow after the weekly Sabbath. And here's another question. Are both these morrows on Abib 15? That's what we want to find out. Moses gave instructions for Wave Sheaf in Leviticus 23, verse 10. He says, Speak to the children of Israel, and you shall say to them, when you come into the land, and that's going to be through the leadership of Joshua, when you come into the land which I give you, and reap its harvest, then you shall bring a sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest. And in Numbers 15, he says, when you come into the land, whither I bring you, then it shall be that when you eat of the bread of the land, you shall offer up a heave offering. That's the wave sheaf. You need to offer up the heave offering unto Yahuwah. These two verses, along with Joshua 5:11, are very specific. They're telling us about how to celebrate wave sheaf when you come into the land of Canaan. This was not for the wilderness. The very next verse in Leviticus 23:11 is a prophecy of what's going to happen. It's a very important verse. Remember, I told you Leviticus 23:11 and Joshua 5:11 go together. This is what it says. Acceptance. On the morrow after the Sabbath, the priest waves it. Morrow after the Sabbath? Now, what kind of Sabbath is that verse referring to? Why? Because we are dealing here with a weekly Sabbath, and we also have a first Sabbath of unleavened bread. We've got two Sabbaths here. Which one can it be? Absolutely. Which morrow is it? In other words, is the wave sheaf established on, remember, we have our Abib 14 Passover right here. So is the morrow and the wave sheaf established on the morrow after this weekly Sabbath, this unleavened bread Sabbath, way over here? Don't forget, we're still assuming that Passover is on Sabbath. We'll break this open. Well, let's look at the word Sabbath according to Moses, because he had to tell us which Sabbath it was. When we read it, and he shall wave the sheaf before Yahuwah for your acceptance. On the morrow after the Sabbath, and you can go and look, it is Strong's number 7676. That's when the priest is to wave it. You can go and look it up. It says Shabbat. It talks about an intermission. Specifically, look what this says, everybody. It says the Sabbath. It doesn't say a Sabbath, any old special Sabbath. Hebrew 7676 is specific, noting that the Leviticus 23:11 Sabbath, this is the weekly Sabbath, and it's designated by this number 7676. However, that's going to raise a question, as most believe that the first day of unleavened bread is also a Sabbath. So here is a question. Are the feast Sabbaths connected to this Hebrew number 7676? And you have to go and look it up. And here's the answer. No and yes. The feast Sabbaths, there are some that are connected to 7676. Well, what are they? Let's go find out. We're going to be using a lot of numbers, so I want you to keep your wits about you. I will have 7677. I'll have this 7 in red to indicate that it's something to do with feast Sabbaths. And if you see the last one in blue, it has something to do with the weekly Sabbath, okay? So 7677 is Shabbaton. It is from 7676 because it's a worship statute. It says a special holiday. It's a rest, of course it is, but it's something special, a special holiday, Shabbaton. So here's some examples of Shabbaton feast Sabbaths. The first day of the Feast of Trumpets, you'll find that in Leviticus 23:24, and the first and the 8th days of the Feast of Tabernacles. They are listed as 7677 Shabbatons. They will have that number beside them. And there is one feast day that gets Shabbat. It's Day of Atonement, the most holy, solemn Sabbath day of the year. It is the only feast Sabbath that is connected to a Shabbat, 7676. The only one. It's a very special day. So, a question. Are the unleavened bread Sabbaths connected to 7676 or 7677? It says, in the 14th day of the first month at even is Yahuwah's Passover. And then it says in Leviticus 23:6, look what it says. And on the 15th day of the same month is a feast. There's your word number. A feast of unleavened bread unto Yahuwah. You have to eat 7 days. And in verse 7, in the first day, we're talking about Abib 15, you shall have a holy, there's your word number, convocation, there's your word number, and you're not supposed to do any servile work. So the festival Sabbaths of the first and the seventh day of unleavened bread and also Pentecost, none of them have the numbers 7676 for Shabbatons or Shabbats. This would be Shabbat set with the 7-6 and Shabbaton. And when I found this out, then I began to wonder what's going on. And I'll tell you why. Because I was taught that the Feast of Unleavened Bread is a Shabbaton. The Feast of Unleavened Bread is a 7677, and I couldn't find it anywhere. The Unleavened Bread Sabbaths are listed as holy convocations or Kodesh convocations. Yes, indeed, they are, but they don't have the number 7677. These are important Hebrew definitions, and we're going to look at them because they're going to come up. Feast, again, is 2282. It's Chog. I got to have our Cog, have Tim pronounce that for me at the end of the session. But it says it's a festival, and it also says it's a solemn feast day. There'll be sacrifices on it as well. The word holy is 6944 or Kodesh. Look what it says, a sacred place, consecrated thing, hallowed. Okay, so well, that sounds all pretty good. And then convocation, it's 4744 Makra. Something that's called out like a public meeting. It's a rehearsal or an assembly. Well, that all sounds good. That sounds like something to do with Feast of Unleavened Bread. That all sounds really good. So let's compare these numbers. Remember, we have our Shabbat with 76 and our Shabbatons. Those are our Feast of Trumpets and Tabernacles. We have 2282, 6944, and 4744. Let's look and see how these are linked to worship statutes, whether they're weekly or annual Sabbaths. I want you to know that the phrases Feast of Unleavened Bread and Holy Convocation, they are never, ever listed along with the weekly Sabbath with that Hebrew number 7676 as Shabbat, and they aren't listed as an annual feast with the Hebrew number of them. But you know what? There is a very good reason for this. This had to be written into the Torah, so there would be no mistake. And people just have to go and look at it. So these Hebrew definitions confirm a wave sheaf placement quite easily. And they tell us that wave sheaf does not follow the holy convocation of the first unleavened bread Sabbath of Abib 15. Not ever, and it never will. In the year of Joshua, when he was crossing the Jordan, the wave sheaf follows only the weekly Sabbath, which is Shabbat, with its placement on Abib 15. So that's how you know it is not a Sabbath of unleavened bread. It is a weekly Sabbath. Wave sheaf doesn't have anything to do with these numbers of feast, holy or Kodesh, or Makra or convocation. Not wave sheaf. It only links and is married to Shabbat. This is probably the most important slide of the whole study right here tonight. Slide 42 has an interesting number for a slide. We're going to look at two covenant calendar statutes. Statute number 1 is Abib 14 is always Passover. And what does it tell us about the 15th? And on the 15th day of the same month is the Feast of Unleavened Bread unto Yahuwah. What do you have after the 14th? You always have Abib 15, and it's always unleavened bread It always follows the Passover day. The second statute is the seventh-day Sabbath that you will find during the Passover festival. There's something special about that as well. We read in Leviticus 23:11, and he shall wave the sheaf before Yahuwah for your acceptance on the morrow after the Shabbat, 7676, after the Shabbat. The priest is to wave it. What happens on the day after the Shabbat? Well, you have Abib 15 and you have the wave sheaf ceremony happening after Shabbat, no matter when the Passover is during the week. Now I want you to look at what Joshua does. Joshua is going to fulfill both of these calendar statutes in absolute perfection. He puts it all together. I guess Yahuwah did it. He had this year arranged just perfectly. In Joshua 5:11, and they did eat of the old corn of the land on the morrow after the Passover. They ate unleavened cakes and parched corn. Look what happens. We have two morrows here to deal with. The first morrow, of course, is the first cycle that follows the Sabbath. And we know that's the wave sheaf because it says that's when you wave the sheaf so that you can have your festival. And the second morrow is going to be Abib 15 because it follows the 14th. So the wave sheaf always follows the Sabbath, and Abib 15 unleavened bread Sabbath always follows Abib 14. And that's how, when you go all the way back and do the puzzle, you will find that Abib 14 Passover is on a seventh-day Sabbath. That is the only way you can get the wave sheaf to follow on the 15th, and unleavened bread is also on the 15th. It's the only way that it works. And Joshua has put them both together so that you can know Abib 16 is not the day for wave sheaf, although it can land on the 16th. Wave sheaf always follows the weekly Shabbat. We're just doing a little review here because you know the children kept Passover. They could have it all night long. This is the cycle exchange right here for the new day. And then you have the first day of the week, unleavened bread is there, but wave sheaf comes first. Wave sheaf is first, and we'll do a little more study on that in the next part. Wave sheaf and unleavened bread share the same day, the day after the Passover. It does follow Passover within the Passover festival week. That's really important too. So finally, we have Passover being confirmed, that's the day season. The wave sheaf is the morrow after the Passover, and it's the morrow after the weekly Sabbath. Wave sheaf is not celebrated over here on the morrow after the 15th, which would be the 16th. Wave sheaf is on the 15th, on the first day of the week. The wave sheaf of the first fruit can only be waved on the day after the weekly Sabbath. It was a prophecy to tell the people exactly when Yahushua would ascend to his Father as the wave sheaf. It was a prophecy for 1,500 years. They were to celebrate it on the first day of the week, so they would never, ever forget. We'll do more on that later. Point number 5, Joshua confirms that we've got to pay attention to which Sabbath days are understood, which ones are Sabbaths or Shabbats, and which ones are Shabbatons. And the wave sheaf is always going to follow the Shabbat, not Shabbaton, the Shabbat, within the Passover festal week. And of course, unleavened bread always follows Abib 14. We all know that. Wave sheaf never, ever, ever follows days linked to these Hebrew numbers. 2282, Chag, 6944, Kodesh, or 4744, Mikra for convocation. It doesn't follow those days. It only follows the Shabbats like it. So here is the little calendar of when this can happen. This is not Joshua's calendar year, but this is where you'll see this happen. when you have a Passover on the 14th, you will have your Shabbat on the 15th, of course, on the Shabbat there, and you'll have this Feast of Unleavened Bread, this 2282, also fall on the same day. But wave sheaf is over here. Remember that Torah instruction, and he shall wave the sheaf before Yahuwah for your acceptance on the morrow after the Shabbat, after the weekly Sabbath, not a feast Sabbath. Right there is your wave sheaf, and it's getting waved after the 7676, even though 2282 is also on the same day. We'll do a little more work on this. Covenant calendar fact, if and when, this is what happens. When wave sheaf follows the first Sabbath of unleavened bread on Abib 16, does that ever happen? Let's take another look. When Passover falls on the 6th cycle of the week or Friday, the first Sabbath of unleavened bread is going to be Abib 15. And of course, it is going to be on a Shabbat. That's just the way it works. But the wave sheaf on Abib 16, the very next day, is following the Shabbat, the 15th. It is not following the high Sabbath of unleavened bread. It follows the Shabbat, even though it looks like it's following the unleavened bread Sabbath. It doesn't. It only follows Shabbat. And that happens about once in every 7 years. It's really important to note what's happening here. So by now, we've put a lot of emphasis on these Hebrew numbers to prove that the wave sheaf follows the weekly Shabbat within the Passover festival. But I want you to know that the Hebrew scholars have generated these Hebrew numbers. And you can't always trust them. You have to do a really good study in order to know if you can trust them. And while these numbers can show the truth of a matter, we also need to have a second witness for proof. And we're going to do that in part 2 when we establish the placement of Pentecost. That's where you'll see the end of this. So you have to stay tuned for part 2. Joshua is confirming that the wave sheaf is on Abib 15. It's after Passover. It's following that weekly Shabbat. Therefore, the Passover had to be celebrated on the weekly Sabbath. And we're back to Enoch. He has every single Passover celebration on the 3rd cycle of the week every single year, at least the most popular Enoch. It happens to be on a Tuesday, and that was the calendar year for Moses. When they came out of Egypt, their Passover was on a 3rd cycle, but that's what Enoch has every single year, not lining up with Joshua at all. Lots of review here, but this time there's a bunny trail. This is our slide for the lunar Sabbath, just one slide. We know that Joshua is confirming that the Sabbath in his calendar year was on Abib 14. Sabbath was on the 14th. But lunar Sabbaths, they don't fall that way. They fall, according to what I understand, on the 8th day of the month, the 15th day of the month, the 22nd, and the 29th, according to the phases of the moon. And it could be the crescent, the conjunction, or the full moon. It doesn't matter. Those are the days of the Sabbaths in a lunar calendar. But Joshua, he does not allow a weekly lunar Sabbath to have recognition on Yahuwah's calendar. He says, this year when I crossed the Jordan, Sabbath was on the 14th. It was not on the 15th. So that kind of gives the lunar Sabbath people a little bit of a challenge, or the lunar Sabbath calendar. Let me say it that way. Finally, we can understand the wave sheaf. And this discovery also eliminates 2 other false teachings. And that is that wave sheaf must always be on the Abib 16. You have to celebrate it on that day no matter what. And the other false teaching is that wave sheaf must also always follow a feast Sabbath, specifically the first Sabbath of unleavened bread. Because when they read that Leviticus verse, they didn't go look up the word Sabbath to see which one it was. So they're both almost the same, but they're a little bit different. And Joshua is telling us, no, it's not like that. Wave sheaf is on the weekly Sabbath And it's that Sabbath that you note that Scripture records 3 Passovers that are easy to calculate, the one for Moses and Joshua and Yahusha. So next, we're going to look at some different sets of charts to see where these Passovers land, because Passover isn't on the same day of the week every single year. We did a little bit of this in our last study, where we said that Passover days of the week are flexible on the calendar, but wave sheaf dates of the month are flexible. The dates are flexible for wave sheaf, but the days are flexible for Passover. Let's take a look at this. You've seen this before if you were with us last week. Passover is always on Abib 14. Wave sheaf is always on the first cycle of the week. Wave sheaf is always on a Sunday. So if you have Abib 14 on the first cycle of the week or a Sunday, your wave sheaf, that's going to be the 14th. Remember, these are all 14s right here. These are all Abib 14. If your Passover is on a Sunday, your wave sheaf will be the next week, which will be Abib 21. If Passover is on a Monday, wave sheafs is going to be on Sunday, Abib 20. It'll be on the 20th. If your Passover is on a Tuesday, like it was with Moses, then wave sheaf is now on the 19th. It's a different date. In Yahusha's year calendar, on a Wednesday cross, with the Passover on the 14th of the midst of the week, Sunday was wave sheaf on Abib 18. It's a different date. If you have a Thursday Passover, your wave sheaf is on the 17th. It's always the first cycle of the week, but now it's on the 17th. And Friday, you'll have a wave sheaf on the 16th. And then we get to Joshua, where he had a Sabbath Passover, and the 15th was the wave sheaf. So you can see the wave sheaf dates are flexible. They can be on a different date every single year, and they are. But Passover is not. It is always on the 14th, but Passover is flexible to the days. It can be on a Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, midst of the week, and so on. It just depends. We know with Moses, that was a very special year when the law was given at Mount Sinai, and for Yahusha, very, very important study to show you exactly where the wave shift was on Abib 18 on that first cycle of the week, crossing the Jordan into Canaan. He didn't cross on Abib 15, but he was celebrating wave sheaf on Abib 15, and it was unleavened bread Sabbath. Now, we had this slide last time, and some of you might have wondered why I put it in here, but I'm going to put it in here again because there was some confusion about dates and or days, and dates and days are not the same. We just took a little calendar here. We're going to pretend that it's the first month, and the first day of the first year on this first month was on the midst of the week, and that would put the 15th on the midst of the week. So it's just a random example just to show you what happens. The 15th date of this first month is not always on the 4th day cycle in every single year. The next year on the first month, it's going to be on a different day. It'll probably be on the 5th cycle or a Thursday. So this is just an example. If you have the 15th next year on the first month, it probably isn't going to be on the same day as it was last year. And that's exactly what happens with Abib 14. It is not always on a Tuesday cycle like Enoch says, and Abib 14 is not always on a Wednesday like Yahusha's Passover was. So let's examine Abib 14 for 3 different years and just see what happens. That's our little chart that we just did. We're going to look at how the Torah dates and the days are flexible. Dates and days, okay? Here's Moses' Passover, just so that you can see the year of Moses. His Passover was on the 3rd cycle. Wave sheaf is on the 19th, the day after the weekly Sabbath within the Passover festival. On Yahusha's calendar, his Passover is on the 4th cycle, the midst of the week. You go all the way to the Shabbat, and then Wave Sheaf here is on the 18th of Abib, not the 19th like it was in the year of Moses. And we've already done Joshua, but let's do it again. In Joshua, we have Passover on the Shabbat, and it also happens to be the very first day of the Passover festival. And of course, Wave Sheaf is the day following it, and we know that it also included unleavened bread. So you can see that Passover is always on the 14th every single year, and Wave Sheaf is always on the first day of the week. You just find Passover, you go to the Shabbat, and the next day is Wave Sheaf. It's really easy. But some people think it belongs somewhere else. Joshua confirms that Covenant Calendar's Wave Sheaf is in direct opposition to Enoch's Wave Sheaf placement. And the question is why? Well, because Enoch's Wave Sheaf is always on Abib 26 outside the week of the Passover festival. So this is a really big problem. Here's Joshua's calendar, not Joshua's calendar, the year of his calendar. We all know that he had Wave Sheaf on the 15th, following the weekly Sabbath within the Passover festival. And here's Enoch. He has Passover right there on the 3rd cycle. Here is your week of Passover festival to the 21st. And then Enoch goes to the next Sabbath and he puts the Wave Sheaf on the 26th every single year. And we're going to tell you why he does that on another study. Here's the proof from one of the popular Enoch Zadok teachings of the First Fruits Festival. The Sabbath dates for the first month were 4, 11, 18, and 25. He says that 26 is the first fruit, and it's outside of the Passover for the Spring Festival. Cannot find this in Scripture. It is nowhere. Joshua's witness is easy to understand, and many that honor Yahuwah's festivals, they suggest that the Wave Sheaf has to be celebrated on Abib 16. In fact, they say it has to follow the first Sabbath of unleavened bread, but we've already shown you that that is not true according to Joshua. And Joshua eliminates those two false teachings that we talked about. In fact, it is absolutely impossible for the Wave Sheaf to be placed on Abib 16 in this account with Joshua. And that's not to say that it can never land on the 16th. It just doesn't do it every single year. And the support for that is definitely in Leviticus 23 and in Numbers. And that study with Exodus 12, 16, and 19, from Passover to the quail manna and then on to Mount Sinai, it shows you it clearly there. And the gospel account also shows very clearly that the Abib, the first Sunday after the Shabbat, is the Wave Sheaf. But then this begs another question. Wave Sheaf can be celebrated on Abib 16, like we already showed you, if, it's a big if Passover falls on the 14th, the 6th cycle, or a Friday, the preparation day. But then Sabbath is Abib 15, and that also includes the Sabbath of unleavened bread. And what happens is that you'll have your Wave Sheaf following the 15th. Wave Sheaf will be on Abib 16 in a calendar that looks like this. That's what it'll do about once in every 7 years. The question that should be pondered is reflected on this calendar below. When Wave Sheaf and the first Sabbath of unleavened bread share the same date of Abib 15. And that's what we had with Joshua. We have Passover on the 14th, and now Wave Sheaf and unleavened bread are both together on the first cycle of the week. And that happens about once every 7 years. But which festival secures first place? We've got Wave Sheaf and unleavened bread, both on the same day. And they're both important. They're both very important festivals, whether they're an annual Sabbath or not. And Joshua here has got them both on Abib 15. the Shabbat of unleavened bread, our Shabbaton, and Wave Sheaf Festival are both on the 15th. Will Joshua give priority to one of them? Will Joshua make the right choice? And does it matter? Or does it really not matter at all? Well, we're going to find out in Joshua's Wave Sheaf in part number 2. With the Wave Sheaf on the first Sabbath of unleavened bread, and unleavened bread is on the, with Wave Sheaf and the first Sabbath of unleavened bread, both on Abib 15, which one of these takes priority? And which of these feasts is going to be the backbone to our salvation? And how shall the correct method for counting the Omer be determined? And one more point, what is the history of how Wave Sheaf became married to Abib 16? We want to know about that. So we're inviting you to part 2 to come and see what's actually going to happen with Wave Sheaf, because Joshua is the one that has the last word on this. And that's the end of our study today. I would just like to thank you so much for being with us tonight. And if you have any questions, we've got some email addresses. You're welcome to email us or give us a phone call. And I just want to thank you for being here tonight and helping me to do this study with you. That's it. That's all she wrote.
Thank you,
Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think you pointed it out. I don't know if it was heard, but Yehusha, our high priest, did a wave sheaf offering on the first day after the Shabbat. He was risen as master of the Shabbat on Shabbat, and the next day he presented his own first fruits offering on the first day, on the first cycle after the Shabbat. So it all points.
And that's coming up in part 2. And Mario's going to teach it.
No. No, you guys are good for that. Any questions? Any comments? We have some first timers. Maybe you might be wondering what is going on. Any questions whatsoever or comments? Wow. Must have been pretty thorough. No comments. Really?
Oh, good. Good. Just want to thank Tim. You know, everyone, this is a team effort between Tim and myself. And he spots things that I don't spot. And he had a wonderful contribution to this particular presentation tonight. And like I said, it's an old presentation, but it has a new look. And just hoping that it'll be, serve you well. Well, if nobody has any questions, then I guess you're all going to be good teachers and you can take it and teach it. I'm just happy that you're understanding things and that it's fun. This is really a fun study to give, and it has so much as a cornerstone.
And can you hear me?
Yes.
This is Don Bergen.
We can hear you, Don.
Yeah, yes, I can. I absolutely can hear you.
Okay, I want to thank you for all of the work that you've done. Obviously, I'm just starting, and so I'm not making any judgments at all. But your presentation was excellent, and it was very positive, and I want to thank you for it.
Thank you, Dawn. And I just raised my hand because I was going to ask you if you had any comments, because I know this is your first one, and I know you're interested in calendar and wanting to understand a little bit better. So I guess you're on the same page and you're off and running.
Yeah.
There's no question that I'm on the same page. I just am still wrestling with all of my background and getting unlearned, because my background is all of this has been taken care of with Messiah. So I'm having to rethink the whole thing, and I thank you for that.
Yeah.
Don is truly a man of Elohim who is led by the Ruach, and I think it's simply amazing that you can be on dial-in without all the graphics and still be able to tune in and listen to the phone like that. So, but next week, hopefully, Don, we'll we'll have you face to face so you can see the screen.
Okay. Well, listen, my approach, at this point at least, is different. It's not a scholastic approach. It's not whether I get the information or not. It's where I get the inspiration. And I got that, and I thank you for that.
Praise you. Hallelujah.
Okay, Don. We'll have to get you get your computer up and running so that you can actually see it, what's happening on the screen, because the calendar studies are very visual. There's a lot of things happening, and if we can't work it out, I will print the studies and I'll send it down to you.
Well, I was able, by listening, I was able to get what I needed at this point, so I want to thank you for that. I think that it would have been confusing for me if I would have seen it. So I must depend on the Spirit, and there's no question that I got what I needed to get.
Good. Excellent.
Hallelujah. Danon, is that your hand raised there?
Yeah, it is, Mario. Yeah. I just wanted to thank Tim and Charlene again, and you too, Mario, for everything Calendar Club has done for the past couple of years. And this study is one of my favorite studies. And I got to tell you, I didn't get it the first time. And even now, watching you do this new one, Charlene, I've got to go back and study it again. And I don't have it, but I got to tell you, I got it a lot more than I did a couple of years ago. And this is a tremendous study that I think we all need to understand, because it's the game changer on why we have Calendar Club.